when a nation becomes too dangerous to predict. Ladies and gentlemen, there is one moment in international politics that terrifies global superpowers more than almost anything else. It is not when a country becomes strong. It is not when a dictator becomes ruthless. It is the moment a leader becomes impossible to predict. Because in geopolitics, the most dangerous enemy is not always the most powerful one. It is the one nobody can calculate. Today, we are going to examine a chilling question. Why does the United States often fear irrational and unstable leaders more than cold, calculating dictators? To understand this, we must step beyond ordinary politics. We must enter the world of political psychology, military deterrence theory, criminal behavioral analysis, and strategic risk management. And once you understand how these systems work together, you begin to see why certain regimes suddenly become labeled as high-risk states, not because they are evil, but because they become uncontrollable. The first warning sign: predictability begins to collapse. A rational authoritarian leader usually follows patterns. He calculates survival. He measures risks. He negotiates when pressure becomes too costly. In other words, even if he is dangerous, he is still understandable. And in international politics, an understandable enemy can be managed. But unstable leaders operate differently. Their decisions become emotional rather than strategic. Anger overrides calculation. Paranoia replaces long-term planning. Humiliation becomes more important than national interest. And this creates the single greatest fear inside military alliances and intelligence agencies. What if nobody can predict the next move? Because once predictability disappears, deterrence starts breaking down. Why deterrence fails? Military strategy depends on one core assumption: rational actors avoid suicidal outcomes. That is the foundation of deterrence. The logic is simple. If you attack, you will suffer catastrophic consequences. Most governments understand this calculation, but unstable leadership changes the equation completely. A leader driven by fear, pride, rage, or political desperation may no longer care about consequences. At that stage, survival psychology overtakes strategic logic. And this is where global powers begin to panic. Because nuclear powers, military alliances, and financial systems are all built on predictable behavior. Once unpredictability enters the system, the risk of catastrophic miscalculation explodes. Wars often do not begin because one side wants war. Wars begin because one side no longer understands the intentions of the other. The psychology of regimes under internal fear. Now let us move deeper. History shows that regimes becoming internally unstable often begin displaying the same behavioral pattern. First, they tighten control over information. Foreign media becomes restricted. Domestic journalists begin practicing self-censorship. Public criticism becomes dangerous. Then comes the second stage. Military commanders are replaced repeatedly. Officials suspected of insufficient loyalty disappear from power. The leadership becomes obsessed with ideological purity. Then comes the third stage. Political opponents are no longer treated as rivals. They become labeled as enemies, traitors, extremists, or threats to national survival. At this point, something psychologically important happens. The regime's internal insecurity begins transforming into external hostility. And this is one of the oldest patterns in political history. Leaders losing stability at home often manufacture conflict abroad, because external enemies can temporarily unify frightened populations. The most dangerous signal in international politics, but the real danger appears when contradictory behavior begins emerging simultaneously. This is where intelligence agencies become deeply alarmed. Imagine a government publicly promising cooperation with its allies, while privately undermining military coordination. Imagine a leader speaking the language of partnership, while simultaneously provoking geopolitical rivals and escalating emotional rhetoric. Strategists call this double signaling. And in diplomacy, double signaling is toxic. Why? Because trust becomes impossible, negotiation becomes unreliable, and alliances begin preparing for worst-case scenarios. At that moment, the regime is no longer viewed as merely aggressive. It becomes viewed as unstable, and instability is infinitely harder to manage than hostility. A hostile government can still negotiate. An unstable government may suddenly act against its own interests. That is the nightmare scenario, when superpowers change strategy. This is the turning point most people never notice. Once a regime receives the internal classification of uncontrollable, everything changes. Diplomacy shifts into pressure. Containment replaces engagement. Isolation strategies begin forming quietly behind closed doors. Because from the perspective of great powers, the issue is no longer ideology. It becomes systemic risk. And systemic risk spreads. One unpredictable leader can trigger military escalation, economic panic, alliance fractures, energy crises, and regional instability all at once. This is why modern geopolitics fears unpredictability more than raw aggression. A rational dictator may be dangerous, but an irrational leader becomes radioactive to the international system itself. Final thought. History repeatedly teaches the same brutal lesson. Strong enemies can be contained. Calculated enemies can be negotiated with. But leaders consumed by paranoia, emotional volatility, and internal fear create a completely different category of danger. Because once emotion overrides strategy, nations stop acting like states and start acting like cornered individuals. And cornered individuals are capable of almost anything. That is the moment global powers begin asking a terrifying question. Is this government still strategic, or has it become unpredictable enough to destabilize the entire region? And in international politics, that question alone can change the fate of nations. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe, share this video, and join us for the next episode where we will break down what major powers actually do once a regime is quietly classified as unmanageable.